So yes, just before we start, just a few words. Hello and welcome to our symposium, Advocacy Challenges and Opportunities for Stepping Up Support for Poverty-Related and Neglected Disease R&D after COVID. I wanted to just raise a few housekeeping reminders. The first is that the session has been pre-recorded, so we will start showing video presentations, and then we will open the floor for questions and comments. But you can post in the meantime any questions or comments in the chat and the QA option, and we will address them in order of appearance. Feel free also to indicate to whom do you want to address your question. So thank you, and I hope that you will enjoy this session, and may I ask the technical team to launch the videos, please. Good afternoon and welcome to the symposium, Advocacy Challenges and Opportunities for Stepping Up Support for Poverty-Related and Neglected Disease R&D after COVID-19. My name is Agustin Martin, and I am the Advocacy Officer responsible for Global Health Research and Innovation in the DSW Brussels team. For those of you who may not know DSW, we are a global development NGO focused inter alia on advocacy in research and innovation for neglected diseases, basically the diseases covered by the EDCTP. The purpose of this session is to discuss how COVID-19 has impacted health research on neglected diseases, both in terms of scientific developments, as well as changes in the global policy and funding landscape. And we will also debate about the risks and opportunities of these changes for neglected disease R&D. We have a panel of experts that will help us tackle some of these questions, and we look forward to discussing with all participants as well. I want to start my presentation by stressing that COVID-19 has contributed to bring public health, and more specifically, health security, into the spotlight of Africa-EU cooperation. Professor Timmermans will present some key new initiatives in this regard, so I will focus my presentation on two key messages. First, that one key opportunity to translate the current political attention on health security into additional resources and improved policies for neglected disease R&D is to highlight the contribution of research, development, and innovation on neglected diseases to responding against the current pandemic. Early this year, DSW commissioned a study to address precisely this point. We asked some researchers to help us identify health research projects, for example, on clinical trials, networks, and health tools that were originally designed for neglected diseases, funded by the European Union, implemented by African and European researchers, and that contributed to address the current pandemic, or had contributed to address previous epidemic outbreaks, for example, on Ebola, or that could be reasonably argued that they have improved health security in Africa. The result is a list of success stories, and that's the ones that you can see on the presentation, funded by the EDCTP in many cases, and sometimes by Horizon 2020, now Horizon Europe, or the Development Cooperation Instrument. One key success story, for example, is that COVID-19 vaccine platforms developed over the past year have relied on decades of prior investigation on HIV, on TB, or Ebola. And some of the technological developments for COVID can actually now be useful for addressing neglected diseases. And this is particularly the case with mRNA technologies, as we can see, for example, with the announcement of BioNTech to develop a first malaria vaccine based on mRNA technology, or Moderna on a similar vaccine for HIV. And both the European Union and the European Investment Bank have already expressed interest in supporting those initiatives. So we have identified clear contributions on neglected disease R&D to address COVID and improve health security in many other areas as well. So in the area of diagnostics, in the area of epidemic surveillance and detection, and access to medical countermeasures as well. Many supported by the EDCTP through its emergency funding mechanism. And this has obviously created a whole debate about whether the new EDCTP, EDCTP3, should expand its scope to include more prominently emerging infectious diseases such as COVID. Whether EDCTP should do that or remain focused on poverty-related and neglected diseases is actually something we will discuss in a few minutes, and Professor Hankins will help us to answer that question. Since there has been a reflection about whether COVID-19, which is not a neglected disease, should be part of the scope of an instrument such as EDCTP, or other instruments are better suited to support those research efforts. My second point is that COVID-19 has also exposed many gaps and challenges in our collective capacity to tackle infectious disease outbreaks, and also has exposed the consequence of chronic underinvestment in this area. As you can see in the next graph, there are many new initiatives that contribute or that could contribute to improve epidemic preparedness and health security in the context of EU-Africa cooperation. For example, on September 16th, the European Commission announced the new European Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, or HERA, aimed at improving EU health security coordination by bringing member states and stakeholders together and reinforcing the global health emergency response architecture. So HERA has a clear mandate to support the global health emergency response architecture, but the mandate on international cooperation is limited to stockpiling, to manufacturing, and to epidemic preparedness. And despite having a strong mandate on research and development within the European Union, it remains unclear whether HERA will support also research and development efforts outside the European Union borders. There are some specific references to supporting African manufacturing and regulatory capacities, which is good news. But for example, the question about the potential synergies with other relevant instruments in the field, such as obviously the EDCTP, but also CEPI, remains to be clarified. And ultimately, all these new initiatives that you can see, whether they contribute to improve epidemic preparedness in a sustainable and efficient manner, will depend on their alignment with the current ecosystem, and in particular, of course, with the EDCTP. It is often the case that decision makers ignore what scientists do, and that scientists are not aware of the new initiatives, the new political initiatives. So with this session, we're aiming to clarify some of those relevant initiatives proposed and the facts concerning EU-Africa cooperation on neglected disease R&D before and after COVID. We hope you can use those messages for your advocacy, for increased funding and improved policies in your respective fields of work. So thank you very much for your attention, and we really look forward to a fruitful conversation. Professor Bartholomew Diki Akinmori is Professor Emeritus of Immunology at the College of Health Sciences in the University of Ghana, where he taught and conducted research into infectious diseases, including clinical trials of candidate vaccines against malaria, meningitis, DPT, and measles. Since 2007, Professor Akinmori serves as Regional Advisor for Vaccine Research and Regulation in the WHO Regional Office in Africa, where he is responsible for vaccine research, regulation, and safety, leading as well the Secretariat of the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, AVAREF. Bartholomew, welcome, and the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be part of this important symposium. Firstly, let me stress that inequity in research and development has really posed a huge obstacle to addressing public health in general, and in particular, public health priorities of developing countries or low and middle income countries of the world. Now, what are the consequences of the impact of inequities in research and development on priority poverty-related diseases and neglected tropical diseases? The consequences are obvious, because this means that new interventions cannot be developed quickly, and interventions which need to improve cannot be improved upon. And this, of course, will affect the diagnosis, the treatment, and the prevention of these priority diseases, which affect the poor, and ultimately also lead to the countries being unable to meet the sustainable development goals, particularly the health-related ones. What are the lessons that we have learned from COVID-19? The first is that COVID-19 research and development has shown that with global solidarity and commitment and partnerships built and led by WHO, that it is possible to accelerate research and development. And the second lesson quickly is that as a result of the global solidarity led by the COVAX facility, it's been possible, not just to promote research and development, but to ensure that this ultimately has led to access to vaccines. The third lesson which COVID-19 has taught us is that African researchers, African regulators are really, really capable of managing research and development of products and approval of products in time for their populations to have access. There are a number of challenges which have been highlighted, and they fit into three main categories. They fit into one, early diagnosis, new diagnostics for COVID-related diseases and for neglected tropical diseases. We need better tools to arrive at diagnosis faster, cheaper, and also to ensure that cases are identified, targeted, treated, and that prevention measures can be put in place to ensure that populations are protected. The second category is broadly a category of therapeutics, because we need new treatments to overcome drug resistance. Now, the third broad category is that of vaccines and how to prevent these priority diseases. While in some cases we need better vaccines, such as a better and improved malaria vaccine, better than the current one in implementation on the continent in 3 countries. We also need vaccines against tuberculosis, which prevent pulmonary tuberculosis. And we, of course, need a vaccine against HIV, no doubt. But we also need to look at vaccines against some of the neglected tropical diseases where this is possible. These priorities need to be addressed urgently. And this is where our partnership with EDCTP is critical. And we need to deepen this partnership, move it to a position where EDCTP not only supports the capacity building efforts in the countries for research, and particularly for the evaluation of products, but that EDCTP is able to help set up technology transfer hubs, support academic institutions and research institutions to become incubators for accepting new technological platforms to develop new interventions through actual research and development, promoting the collaboration with industry, that the continent is able to set up local manufacturing sites for many vaccines and therapeutics that address these important diseases. Indeed, if these diseases are not addressed by the region itself, by the countries themselves, we'll continue to have the inequity which exists right now in research and development of products against these principal diseases which affect the continent.
Dr. Nick Chapman is a medical doctor and the CEO of Policy Cures Research, the global think tank responsible for the annual J-Funder report, the most comprehensive tool documenting and explaining global funding on neglected disease R&D. Dr. Chapman has extensive experience in health, policy, and practice as a doctor, researcher, and analyst. He is a guest lecturer at the University of Sydney, an expert advisor on research and development to the Access to Medicines Index, among others. Dear Nick, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much to DSW for organising this session and to EDCTP for organising the 10th EDCTP Forum. Sorry it couldn't be in person, but I'm really honoured to share the panel with these esteemed colleagues and looking forward to some interesting discussion afterwards. So I've been asked to talk about the state of neglected disease R&D funding after COVID-19 and sort of the risks and opportunities for neglected disease funding because of the pandemic. The answers to these questions aren't entirely clear yet, but this is exactly the sort of question that the GFunder project, which my organisation conducts, is designed to answer. This is a bit unfortunate timing. We collect data on the funding landscape for R&D retrospectively. We're just in the process of validating funding for 2020 now. So we can't really give a sneak peek yet, or we don't have a picture yet of exactly what happened to funding for neglected disease R&D and emerging infectious disease R&D in 2020. But we do have a few pieces of data and analysis to go on. The first of these is the state of the R&D landscape for neglected disease R&D before COVID hit. And it was probably in the healthiest state it's ever been. Funding had been increasing consistently for the last 5 years or so. There'd been, and was pretty much at a record high. There was increases in funding across sectors, across diseases. There was increasing funding from countries other than just the United States. There was increased funding from the European Commission and partners through EDCTP. Emerging donors, India playing a significant role, etc. It's not to say that everything was perfect, and we know that funding is still far short of where it needs to be, and that, for example, funding for NTDs specifically had been stagnant for more than a decade, whilst funding for NDs more broadly climbed to these record highs. But it was a fairly positive picture. And the second is that we've somewhat been here before. So when the 2014-15 West African Ebola outbreak hit, we saw a massive influx of investment in R&D for Ebola and Marburg specifically, and there was significant concern about what this would mean for neglected disease R&D funding. And then in the following years, subsequent years, with the emergence of the WHO R&D blueprint for pandemic preparedness, or preventing a pandemic, and the sort of more emergence of a more structured R&D agenda for emerging infectious diseases, and then subsequently the launch of CEPI, and increasing funding for that, there was lots of concern about what that would mean for funding for neglected disease R&D. But what we actually saw was that whilst there were definite short-term reappropriations of funding and R&D capacity in the immediate term, from some ND R&D programs to Ebola, a lot of this was reinstated effectively pretty soon, often within the same year. And in some cases, neglected disease R&D actually benefited from unused emergency funding appropriated for Ebola. So what we saw was growth collectively in both neglected disease R&D funding and emerging infectious disease R&D funding at the same time, both increasing to record highs, without the sort of deleterious effect on ND funding, the cannibalisation that we were concerned about at the time. Now, the situation with COVID is an order of magnitude bigger. So in addition to the GFunder report, which looks retrospectively and really rigorously about what's actually been dispersed in a given year for global health R&D, when COVID hit, we started looking also in real time at the commitments that were announced for future funding. And in the first 9 months of 2020 alone, more than $9 billion were committed to R&D, not the COVID R&D, COVID-19 response more broadly, but specifically to COVID-19 R&D, which is more than double everything that's invested in a single year in all of the other 60 diseases and health areas across neglected diseases, emerging infectious diseases, and SRH covered by the GFunder surveys. So it's yet to be seen exactly what this means for neglected disease R&D funding. But as I say, the history suggests, and the early returns from the G-Finder data that we're validating suggest that the effect on neglected disease R&D hasn't been disastrous. And the historical evidence suggests that this really could be a tide that lifts all, or at least multiple boats. The other element is the wider economic impact of the pandemic, and what this is going to mean for neglected disease R&D funding. We've recently just completed an analysis looking at historical ND funding and wider economic impactors, including GDP, government spending, ODA, etc. And found that there actually isn't really a strong relationship, at least in the short term, between changes in GDP, countries' economic status overall, and their level of funding for neglected disease R&D. But there is a strong correlation for both ODA specifically and for government spending overall. So what this suggests, the first point to make, is that some of the stimulus spending that we typically see, and we have seen already in response to the pandemic and to the economic effects of that pandemic, are likely to be protective for neglected disease R&D funding. And again, we have some precedents for this. In the previous peak in neglected disease R&D funding back a little over a decade ago in 2009 was in part a result of economic stimulus spending related to the global financial crisis at the time. So while we're yet to see definitively the sort of actual and likely future effects of COVID-19 on neglected disease R&D funding, I think there's significant reason to be optimistic. Thank you very much for your time.
Professor Marleen Timmerman is a medical doctor, researcher, and former senator. In her prolific career, she has authored more than 500 books and articles, in particular in the area of women's health. She has served as director of the Department of Reproductive Health and Research of the WHO, and is currently chairing the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the Aga Khan University Hospital in Nairobi. She's also a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the EDCTP Association, as well as a member of the Africa-EU Advisory Group on Research and Innovation Cooperation. Welcome, Marleen. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to give this presentation on poverty-related neglected diseases, R&D, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before I start, I want to make a few bullet points, actually, that come from a recent publication in JAMA from Anthony Blinken and his colleague, who is saying, summarizing, in a globalized world, regional public health organizations should be more involved in decision-making, including priority setting. And you will hear that during my presentation. It's not only at the implementation phase, but co-creation and priority setting jointly in Africa is very important. And the international community must mobilize sustained financing. Without sufficient funding, of course, from the governments and the regions, but also from the international community, it is really difficult to detect and respond to the biological threats, to help the countries, and to fund the really needed research and development for new treatments and rapid response. And global leaders must strengthen this global governance with an emphasis on transparency and accountability. So these are a few points that I really also want to subscribe. Now, my presentation is kind of a summary of some work that I was involved in, because Africa's importance for the EU strategic external relations is increasing over the years. So they created this advisory group with experts that were selected equally from Europe and from Africa to address 4 thematic pillars. The report, of course, will be fully available to you, but some key findings here are that, number one, surely more investment is needed in R&I against poverty-related and neglected diseases, including the unfinished MDG agenda, also non-communicable diseases, mental health, and other conditions. EDCTP has really successfully, it's a success story, developed R&I networks and collaborations across Africa and Africa EU, and but mainly focusing on the poverty-related diseases that remain the leading cause of mortality and morbidity. The Africa-EU cooperation on R&I to eradicate these diseases needs to be reinforced, and we need to ensure support for late-stage clinical research of upcoming health products. While EDCTP is widening in scope, the Africa-EU cooperation should also encourage the creation of more EDCTP modeled collaborations, but in other priority areas of health cooperation that complement and maximize the impacts of the EDCTP and creating a more sustainable and enabling environment for health R&I. And research expertise, data, product development platforms, and networks play a very important role in strengthening epidemic preparedness and health security. Now, some recommendations for future EU cooperation are the 3 thematic areas that we have selected. Number 1, more capacity building in research and innovation. And programs are on the way, like EDCTP with the ACDC have initiated a lot of training. Number 2 is ethics and regulatory environment. Support for African institutions such as the AMA, ACDC in collaboration with their European counterparts, and also support of African European research initiatives that we just mentioned a few there on the screen. Number 3, it's great to have great research data, to have great frameworks, but the $1 million question still remains: how do you go from research and innovation to policies and practices that really make a difference? We publish, we make guidelines, we make resolutions, we make decisions, but a lot of that is not really translated into and on the ground, in the field, mechanisms that are sustainable and make a difference in the health sector. So looking forward, there are a number of important strategic decisions to be taken. And we recommend, number 1, a better alignment between EU programs in Africa, in particular between DG R&I and DG Impact. And we are happy to see this happen now. We have, of course, EDCTP, we have European Research Council grants, our RISE program, but then we have development initiatives, and I'm not going to read them here, but just a few examples that we underlined. And it's so important that there is a good alignment between the research feeding into the development programs, and the development programs also prioritizing research and very good interaction. And that is important within the European, but also between EU and AU, of course. Number 2, involvement of African member states or stakeholders in the design and the development of EU-supported initiatives, not only as it happened too much in the past in the implementation phase, but really in the co-design and the co-creation, because that is needed to reach effective development cooperation. Number 3, investing also in developing capacity on health and research policies in the EU delegations in the countries. It's very critical, because in many delegations in the past, there is no health and there is no research office. And if we want to improve coherence, alignment, and effectiveness of EU initiatives, the role of the delegations of the embassies is so important. It's really a requisite to ensure that Africa EU R&I cooperation is driven by local needs and expertise. And then finally, the current platform for R&I dialogue between Africa and the EU, the high-level policy dialogue on science, technology, and innovation should be, and we hope it will be, more inclusive. The HLPD should regularly organize events, consultations to discuss with officials and stakeholders, design, implementation, impact. So it should be a continuous dialogue with regular feedback and publishing of the data and studies in this area. My last slide is just a few political events, very important now, recent in the COVID pandemic. We know WHO Chief Tedros here with Germany's Angela Merkel opening the global pandemic hub in Berlin, the European and African Union signing a partnership to scale up preparedness, start of manufacturing plants to produce the vaccines in African settings, and here a picture of the EU-AU Summit 2017, but the next one is planned early next year, and it's really important to have our recommendations, amongst others, of course, also discussed at the next EU-AU Summit. Thank you very much.
Professor Catherine Hutchins is a community medicine specialist and current chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the EDCTP and the Scientific Advisory Group of the United States National Institutes of Health HIV Prevention Trials Network. Among other responsibilities, Professor Hutchins was Chief Scientific Advisor to UN/AIDS, leading the scientific knowledge translation team focused on ethical and preparatory HIV prevention trial conduct. She works as Assistant Professor in the Department of Global Health at the University of Amsterdam and as Professor of Public and Population Health at the University McGill in Montreal. Dear Kate, we're delighted to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today on harnessing COVID-19's momentum to advance poverty-related neglected disease research and development. I'm going to start first by reviewing EDCTP2 activities so that you get a feel for what we've been doing, and then look at the scientific impact of COVID-19 in research and development, and how we can harness the momentum created by the COVID-19 pandemic, and what are the lessons learned that should inform research and innovation going forward. Now, EDCTP2 has supported research activities in 19 European and 41 African countries, shown here in the map on the right. A total of 814 million euros has been awarded. There have been 140 collaborative research grants with large-scale clinical trials and other clinical research activities conducted by European African consortia. There have been 90 grants that strengthen the enabling environment for conducting clinical trials and clinical research, so really building clinical research capacity. And there have been 200 fellowship grants awarded to focus on the career development of African scientists. If we look at the collaborative clinical research projects, we can see that 72 million euros has gone to neglected infectious diseases. Now, COVID has had a major impact on EDCTP funded projects. There have been delays and disruptions in research, repeated suspensions of recruitment during multiple waves of the pandemic, lower recruitment rates and non-attendance due to fear of contracting SARS-CoV-2, transport disruptions and costs, and research staff illness. There have been extended timelines for ethical and regulatory approvals for a number of reasons. Restrictions affecting transport of essential equipment, reagents, investigational products, and samples that has meant expiry and shortage of these medicines and products. And there have been closures of institutions and bans on meetings. There have been knock-on effects of delays in other projects, protocol amendments to include testing and other COVID-19 measures, and very real pressure on clinicians and researchers in Africa and Europe and on their workloads. The closure of schools and childcare facilities affected those with parental responsibilities, especially women scientists, fellows, and students. There have been increased costs per project, both salary costs and contracts, as well as personal protective equipment. And the only real savings have been on travel to meetings. There have been impacts on the fellowships and on students, for example, with many training attachments postponed. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa, if we look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have seen the focus on COVID-19 and Ebola virus disease meant disruptions of immunization campaigns, leading to almost 7,000 deaths from measles being recorded. So the potential for threats of resurgence of other vaccine-preventable infectious diseases is very real. However, the good part of this is that the capacity and the experience built during the Ebola virus disease outbreak in DRC were used to respond to COVID-19. So how can we harness the momentum and advance research and development? EDCTP has been collaborating with major initiatives in COVID, both COVID-R as an observer member and as a working group member of the COVID Circle, the WHO R&D Blueprint Global Coordination Mechanism, the WHO Global Malaria Program, the WHO Afro Expert Committee, the COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition, the reconciliation of cohort data in infectious diseases, and Africa CDC, both in joint investments in epidemiology and biostatistics training, and in the Consortium for COVID-19 Vaccine Trials, CONCAVAC. CONCAVAC is providing support and linking both clinical trial sites and vaccine developers. It's developed for COVID, but can be used for any of the diseases that are of importance in sub-Saharan Africa. It's building capacity at clinical trial sites, providing seed funding. It has political support from African Union heads of states, and it will provide fast-tracked processes of decision-making for promising products to get into trials and to go forward to regulatory approval. If we look at the lessons learned that should inform things going forward, I think it's useful to look back at EDCTP2 and our prioritization criteria for the strategic research agenda. We ask, does a disease disproportionately affect people in sub-Saharan Africa? Is there a need for new or improved medical products? Is there insufficient commercial market to attract R&D by private industry? Considering the current global products landscape, are there potential medical products worth considering for progression in clinical development? Are other funders better placed and already investing sufficiently in these priority R&D areas? And based on what we know, is there sufficient justification for EDCTP to prioritize this disease? Now, the EDCTP3 EU-Africa Global Health Partnership will be launched in the first quarter of 2022, all things considered. And there is a strategic research and innovation agenda that the EDCTP board has a working group focused on. Andrea Spellberg will present later today on the joint undertaking, and I recommend that you listen to her talk. Among the key features is a greater emphasis on phase 3 and 4 trials and product-focused implementation studies. And there's a very real recognition of the fact that COVID has changed the way in which clinical trial processes run and their timeframes. So there have been lessons learned that we need to take forward into EDCTP3. EDCTP3 will recognize the importance of related infectious disease threats and the opportunities for synergistic investments, including emerging and re-emerging diseases, climate crisis-related infectious disease, antimicrobial resistance, and co-infections and comorbidities. This is a schema that's been proposed. It's not the final schema, but it gives you a good idea of the integrated approach and scope, with clinical research being the main focus and the capacity building around it and the various diseases in the circle. So I look forward to active and lively discussion with you all now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody, for the presentations and for the technical team for arranging those. Now we open the floor for questions. We have roughly 10 minutes for that. I see that we also have one question already posted, will be addressed in a few minutes. I think it is better that our expert on R&D funding for neglected diseases addressed that question, although it was addressed to me. So I've kindly invited Nick to respond to it.
Yes, very happy to. Thanks, Agustin. And thanks, Dorian, for the question. It's a very good one. So for anyone that can't see the Q&A box, just to clarify, the question is about the fact that although that there was an increase in funding for neglected disease R&D pre-COVID, what was the distribution of funding across the different product areas, across therapeutics, prevention, vaccines, vector control products, and diagnostics? Which was the most funded, and were there or are there any changes to be expected in terms of prioritization going forward? And the first observation I just make is that to reinforce the fact that not each of the product types is equally expensive, or R&D for each of the product types is equally costly. So it is expected and normal to see an unequal distribution across, where there's significantly more investment in vaccines and drugs, for example, which require large and expensive clinical trials and with longer development timelines, and less investment, relatively speaking, in diagnostics, especially, or in vector control products. Having said that, though, we have seen some really significant changes over the last sort of decade. Vaccines is still and has always been the most funded area, but it's dropped between 2009 and 2020 from accounting for about 40% of all funding for neglected disease R&D to just under a third. Funding for basic research has also declined over the same period, whilst funding for drugs has increased from just 16% in 2009 up to more than a quarter, or around a quarter. And funding for biologics has really been not on the radar for most of the last decade, but increasingly in the last few years has started to climb from a very low base. And so this is quite interesting in thinking about the patterns that we saw in COVID, where a huge focus of investment was in vaccines and also in biologics, and very little in small molecule drugs. And it's only now we're seeing with broad spectrum antivirals some focus on drugs. So I think it's likely to see a lot of investment, perhaps going back to vaccines, and particularly to vaccine platforms, and an increasing focus on biologics for sure. Thanks, Agustin.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. There is a question posted to Professor Akanmori in the chat, but I don't see him connected. Bartholomew, are you connected? Have you managed to join? If not, I will ask myself a question. So warm up question. There is actually a question from Professor Makanga. So I'm going to read it. Nick, your pre-read indicates that currently R&D funding for NTDs seem to be protected in the 2020 funding data, despite the COVID pandemic. Could this observation be attributed to pre-COVID-19 committed funds, and that the actual impact of COVID may manifest in the subsequent years? Nick, can you pick up that one? And then I'll ask a question myself if I can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, once again, a great question. And I think that's quite an accurate observation, Michael, that it's almost certain that a significant proportion of that 2020 investment and what we've seen of, sort of early quarter 2021 was, as you say, already committed. We saw, in previous outbreaks I alluded to, 2014-15, there was some reprioritization or reallocation of already committed funding. So the fact that the funding is committed doesn't always protect it, but we are likely to see potentially some of the effects down the line. The counter force to that, I guess, is some of the elements I alluded to about the protective effect of stimulus investment. So the ARA Act funding, particularly through NIH, a decade ago saw a lot more investment in basic research and a similar flow through in some of the other medical research councils around the world. And hopefully a spillover effect from an increased focus on emerging infectious diseases might be seen in some of the cross-platform investment.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. So I have a question to Professor Handkensel, which is a bit of $1 million question about EDCTP3. And as you mentioned in your presentation, the partnership is going to be launched at the end of the year, early next year, fingers crossed, if COVID allows. So I'm curious to know more about the development of the scientific research innovation agenda for 2021-2022. How was the process, which could not have been easy in the middle of a pandemic? And what criteria was followed to identify priority and product gaps? Thank you.
Thank you, Augustin. I don't seem to be able to turn on my video, so I'll just speak a little bit about it. It has been a process that started back in 2020, early in the pandemic, working on the strategic research and innovation agenda. There was inspiration from the strategic research agenda that the EDCTP2 Scientific Advisory Committee updates every year. From there, it went to both at the Commission, to Elmer Nimiskern and Inma Paynes, who kind of piloted things at the Commission, and to a working group of the EDCTP Association, led by Detlef Booking and Andrea Spellberg. It has been updated as well with suggestions from our Scientific Advisory Committee, the EDCTP2 one more recently, and now is moving forward. So the slide that I showed that had the 6 priority questions, the fundamental questions we pose, that has been in the back of our minds always, looking at what should be the justification for EDCTP to prioritize a specific disease. So I'll stop there. If we want, we can also ask Michael Makanga, the current executive director, to say a word. I think you're allowed to unmute him. The technical people can unmute him and ask him to speak.
Sure, that would be great. Michael, do you want to give some additional thoughts to that point? And if so, can you unmute him, please?
Yes, I just did. He just needs to accept on his end.
He did momentarily there. Michael.
Yeah, I've just been unmuted now. I just wanted to, first of all, concur with what Catherine has reported back and indicate that this strategic research and innovation agenda also went through a very broad consultative process that involved all member states and was also on the EC website to ensure that feedback from the member states and the research community was captured. And this also included feedback that came from all like-minded product developers, in addition to the advice that have also come from the Scientific Advisory Committee and the General Assembly constituency. Over to you.
Thanks so much for that additional thoughts. Are there any other questions from the floor? I think we have 5 minutes more. If not, I would ask another myself to Marlene. Marlene, you stressed in your presentation the importance of alignment between EU initiatives in Africa, in particular research and development cooperation. And I think probably one of the most important areas in that sense could be health system strengthening, because obviously DCTP does important work on regulatory strengthening and ethics review strengthening, and the EU is a very substantial investor in health systems in Africa through development cooperation, through development cooperation aid. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this alignment could happen? How could the EU improve and synergize those investments a bit better that are aimed to health system strengthening?
Thanks for that question, Agustin. And I think number one, to prioritize that in the EU agenda, because as you know, health traditionally in the old days was not really very high on the development agenda. It has now gone up a lot, and after COVID even much more. And I'm not talking about the research now, but about the development. So a good evolution is that there is more alignment between and more dialogue and interaction between DG Research and Innovation and DG Development, called now DG International Partnerships. So that is a good start, I think. Also to leverage health on their political agenda, to ensure that in the delegations there is an health office and science and technology offices, where there are EU officers really having this as a priority and not as a kind of an additional task in other assignments. And then I think while we are at lessons learned, is that if there is a vertical approach, let's say HIV, for example, can have a real good impact on also strengthening not only the vertical programs, but the health systems in general. But therefore, we need to invest not only the EU or the AU, but together and also with other partners in really primary healthcare systems. So where we have a kind of a foundation, of a fundament rather, to then end vertical approaches where needed. If there is an outbreak, of course, we have to be able to address the outbreak, but we also have to invest continuously and simultaneously in resilient healthcare systems, and that thinking has to be prioritized. Thank you.
Okay. The session will end now. Thank you so much all for joining, and yeah, please keep posted and keep your questions via email coming. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Agustin, and all.
Thank you. Good session, Agustin.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.